So thank you both. I'm just to remind my students who will hopefully be watching this. I'm Kathryn Hellerstein. This is for a follow-up of an assignment from October 15th, 2020 for Germanic Languages 262, Women and Jewish Literature. We have the great privilege of having Darra Goldstein and Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblet join with me to respond to some of the questions that you, my wonderful students, have put forth to them, having watched their conversation on the virtual cookbook tour, perusing extraordinary cookbook collections with Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblet and Darra Goldstein. And your questions came before you heard Darra's talk, official public lecture on the evening of October 15th. So the questions don't address what Darra talked about there, which was the Ashkenazi kitchen in America. But I think it segues, what we're going to talk about segues in. So how should we do this? I guess Barbara, you pulled my students, I don't know, 20-some questions together into categories, thematic categories. So I think I'll just start. I'll just ask some of the questions. And
actually, I think we probably would like to thank you for taking up this topic with your students, for inviting your students to ask questions, and for these extremely interesting questions. So interesting that I thought it would be great for us to have a conversation because I think we find the conversation interesting, and I hope your students will too.
I hope so too.
I was blown away by how deeply they thought about things.
They're dear students, you're listening to this, but I agree. I think my students, I've been very lucky with this group of students. They are very thoughtful and observant, and we've been reading the Bible and Techinas, Yiddish prayers for women, and a little bit of Midrash and Old Yiddish and medieval Hebrew poems by women. So they're bringing that point of view to food and to cookbooks in the 20th century. We're now moving into the 20th century in our readings and thinking about women's lives and writings in a Jewish cultural and religious tradition. So one of the first questions that somebody posed on the assignment was, can you describe Jewish cuisine in 3 words?
And why? That was the one question I didn't want to answer because I never like to be reductive. I'm all about nuance and about building upon things. And I think if you talk about Jewish cuisine, then the first thing you ask is which aspect of Jewish cuisine are you talking about? Because it's not one unilateral thing. So if I had to choose a word, one single word, it would be evocative, because the food in many cases is so symbolic or so laden with religious meaning that it evokes other feelings, but that doesn't begin to describe it culinarily as food.
Can I just say that you answered in a very Jewish way? I would take the first part of your answer to be the answer on top of evocative, which is you answered a question with a question, and you said, which Jewish cuisine? That's 3 words, and that's a good way to define it, in my opinion.
Right. Well, I would answer it 2 ways. That Jewish is as Jewish does. So it's another way of expressing what Darra expressed, which is that we're not dealing with one singular universal phenomenon, that we're dealing with food, if you will, what Jews prepare, eat, find meaningful, form emotional connections to across time and across space and in different communities. So Jewish as Jewish does would be my first. But then if I had to limit myself to 3 words, then the 3 words that I would offer each of them would be the starting point for a discussion. And they would be halacha, meaning, of course, a Jewish religious law, minhag, meaning customary practice, and cuisine. And it's the relationship of those 3 that defines Jewish cuisine, not, I would say, seen from a very broad historical perspective, from a broad geographical perspective. And you could, well, as to whether you can take any one of those elements out, probably you could, but that would be my starting point.
Great. Wonderful. Both fantastic answers, both evocative. So another question that was asked is, how has the concept of Jewish food evolved over time? And has it changed across locations? I think you started answering that already, Darra, but if you want to say something more about that.
Sure, I can. Then Barbara can jump in on the next question to begin it. It's definitely changed over time and place. In general, as Jews have gone into the diaspora, there has been, among many of them, an urge to assimilate. And so then decisions are made about what foods to admit into Jewish culinary practice and how strictly to abide by the laws of kashrut. And this doesn't affect everyone, of course, but it was certainly played out in the United States in the late 19th century when the more assimilated earlier wave of German Jews came, and then their Eastern European brethren came later and were more religious. And the idea of what makes a Jewish home really depended on how deeply you believed in what you ingest as being the primary marker of Judaism. So I think of Aunt Babette's cookbook, for example. There was published, what was it, 1889, Barbara? 1888 or 1889, where she defines treifa as that which is hygienic and sanitary. And that is a very modern way to think about it, but it doesn't follow the laws.
Well, what I would say is that, of course, Darra is quite right. It's not as if there was something called a Jewish cuisine and then it changed. So I think that we have to start from where we started at the beginning of our discussion, and that is that, if you will, you've got a diversity of Jewish communities. They're living in different places, different climates, different seasons, different available fresh produce. They're living among other people. And so you have to start with diversity. The starting point is the diversity of what Jews in different places and different times prepared. Then if we talk about change, we can ask ourselves, under what conditions does this culinary culture change? And Darra has already suggested some, which has to do with acculturation, assimilation, but also social class, which is to say, it's not the same thing. It's not necessarily the same thing as assimilation as such, but there are class differences, and also there are food trends and food styles. There are, if you look at if we look today, for example, today the kosher food industry offers the kosher home an array of possibilities that was unimaginable 50 years ago, simply unimaginable. Go into any supermarket and check the label on almost everything, and you will see that the majority of what you will look at in the supermarket will have some kind of a hechsher, some kind of a rabbinic seal of kashrut, that it's kosher. Beverages, baked goods, things in tins, packages, and also all kinds of innovations. So whether it's kosher bacon, in quotation marks, or it's kosher shrimp. And in fact, the name of that product when it first came out was, it's not shrimp.
I remember that.
Jewish. That is so unbelievably Jewish. And so if you want to do a case study, when you ask how does the food change, look at the bagel. Just simply look at the bagel. Start with something that looks like a pretzel, then it's a bagel, then it's got the standard variations, and then it goes wild. It just simply goes wild. Rainbow bagels, pina colada bagel. I kid you not, there is a pina colada bagel. I don't know if what it was, but so you could take one food, the bagel, and just look at its look at its biography. And you would have an answer. That would be one answer to the question. Go to the kosher food fair. Go to the supermarket, and look for everything that's kosher. That would be another answer to the question. Look at cookbooks, and look at the way they've changed, and look at the diversity of them, and who they're appealing to. That would be another indication of what's changed. So I would say that that would be a starting point.
Yeah, those are several good starting points. One of my favorite Jewish cookbooks is produced in Sydney, Australia, the Monday Morning Cooking Club. And they have, I think, 2 out, and they're just about to come out with a 3rd volume, which is all about baking. And when I first opened it, I loved reading the stories. I liked seeing the photographs of the women and the foods they were making, but I was thinking, why is this Jewish? There was a baked salmon, or there were all kinds of foods that were just sort of regular foods. They weren't marked as being distinctively Jewish. But what made them Jewish was that these women came from Jewish homes, felt very strongly about observing Shabbat and different holidays, and incorporating whatever foods they had, because this was a diasporic community from South Africa, from other parts of Africa, from Europe, from Canada. They came from all over, but they shared in a belief in the Jewish home, and the food made in the Jewish home was then Jewish.
Exactly. Jewish is as Jewish does. I think there's another aspect. That is, if I were to take, say, Poland, and I were to take my grandmother's cooking. So whether it's soup, stuffed cabbage, whether it's any one of any number of dishes, they are not marked as Jewish until she comes to Canada, and they are different from what Canadians cook. But as long as in Poland, they are virtually the same, whether it's a mushroom barley soup, or it's pierogi, or it's some other dish. So many of those dishes were shared with their Polish neighbors that in the Polish context, there was nothing particularly Jewish about them. But when Jews came and brought that repertoire with them, many of those foods came to be identified as, quote, Jewish. So context also, I think, plays a role.
Yeah, same thing's true with things like stuffed cabbage leaves from Russia, or even borscht, which a lot of people think is Jewish, and then the Russians claim it, but in fact it's Ukrainian. So you can
Darra,
back and back.
Did you see most recently that Ukrainians are going to the UN?
Oh yes, to get it part of the cultural heritage.
They want it on the list of intangible cultural heritage. Moscow is protesting. I'm waiting for Poland to protest, and I want to know, where are the Jews?
I think the Jews don't want to get mixed up in it right now.
Best just to make it.
Yeah.
Yep. Yum. I'm getting hungry. I just had lunch, but I want more now. So this is just wonderful. What are some of the traditional Ashkenazi Jewish foods that have gotten lost over time and are no longer in the mainstream? And then maybe a connected question would be, how quickly were Jewish foods found in the Americas? The Jewish foods found in the Americas adopted or adapted by Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe. And they're attributing the potato as an American food, a New World food. Is it?
Oh, there are a lot of, okay. So maybe let me start with the ones that are lost. Okay, so my grandfather's favorite food was beef testicles. And my grandmother used to put a hot shovel in the coals, and then she would put the beef testicles on the hot shovel, and that was how she roasted them. So, you know, clearly that's not, well, there are communities and there are restaurants that specialize in offal. So it's not as if these foods are completely gone, but in terms of what you would expect to find in a Jewish cookbook, or, you know, in the places in most Jewish homes, you're not going to have a shovel, you're not going to have the coals, and you're not going to have the testicles. So let's start there. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, my aunt, from my mother's side, used to make stuffed spleen. So the spleen looks like a very long, thin, narrow thing, and she'd put a knife inside it to make a pocket, and she would stuff it and roast it, and then she would slice it. I haven't seen that lately. Then my grandmother.
What did she stuff it with?
Oh, it would have been like, say, flour, maybe ground meat, onions, garlic, usually, and she liked to make things very salty, peppery, and very, very flavorful. My grandmother, who was, I would say well enough off that she could have eaten, steak every day of the week, her absolutely favorite dish was to fry some onions and then chop up lung, spleen, and beef cheeks, and make a little kind of a fricassee, a little kind of a stew. And when I first got married, actually, oh my God. Okay, so when I got married in 1964, and we lived in the Jewish market, Kensington Market in Toronto, which was actually 2 blocks away from where I grew up. So my husband and I were living above a fruit stall, and it was all, was like the dairy and the baker and the Jewish bakers and the fishmongers and whatnot, and of course the kosher butchers. And Prusky's kosher butcher was around the corner. So I used to go there, and now that I think of it, it was the following. So first of all, he had whole lungs hanging from hooks behind him. He's at the counter and he has these lungs hanging from hooks. So I used to say, I'll take a left ventricle. I'll take some lung. And then I bring the lung home, because we didn't have a penny to our name. I'd bring the lung home and I would divide it between us and the cat. So I had, and I had it in plastic bags. And if you've ever put lung in a plastic bag, this sort of pink, fleshy thing in a plastic bag in your refrigerator, you open up the refrigerator, you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? So between the cat has half of it, we had half of it, and we sauteed it. I chopped it up and sauteed it with onions, and it was absolutely fine. Now, these Jewish butchers were absolutely notorious for making obscene, or I would say, sort of scatologic. They like to tease the women. So in the front, so behind the butcher was lungs, and on his counter in the front were these white enamel little trays where he had, heart, kidney, various organ meats. And then he had one tray, and it was very mysterious to me, and I didn't know what it was. So I said to him, and of course, speak to him in Yiddish, what is it? He says, Beitzim. I says, Beitzim? Ich habe es keinmal nicht gesehen. Was heißt Beitzim? He says, in Yiddish, keinmal nicht? So in other words, I said to him, what is that? I've never seen it. He says, never. So Beitzim is like Lashon Kodesh, in Yiddish for eggs, meaning balls, meaning testicles. Testicles. So in fact, the testicles were there. That 1964, he was selling testicles. I don't know who was making it. And also, oxtails we know. But I'm trying to think, there are Hazel. I don't know if anybody makes Hazel anymore.
Oh, yes, I was going to mention Hazel.
Neck, right?
Yeah, it's a stuffed neck. And you see a leitmotif here where you take these lesser parts of animals that are really delicious, but people tend to discard them because you have to work with them a bit more or you have to cook them longer. But they're stuffed with the same sorts of things that Barbara was describing with the spleen. So it's onions, it can be breadcrumbs, it can be some meat. And it's either a chicken neck or a turkey neck, which is even better because it's bigger. To me, sort of the iconic forgotten dish is pcha.
Oh, I was going to mention pcha.
And I have to direct your students to the Schmaltzy, the Jewish Food Society Schmaltzy benefit from a few years ago, where I gave a presentation about the role of pcha in my life and my identity. And so go to the Jewish Food Society website and you can listen to that and hear the story of pcha. And that is jellied calf's feet. And it's so interesting to me because bone broth, for instance, took the culinary world by storm some years ago, and everyone is talking about how restorative it is and how good for you. And pcha, in many countries, like in Turkey, for instance, it's eaten hot as this very rich soup. But in the Russian tradition, it tends to be chilled, and then it turns into like a meat jello. And you have lots of garlic. You can add some hard-boiled eggs. It's really fantastic. So I think that all of these innards and, the kishka and all of these other things that we tend to overlook now or disdain were a really important part of traditional Ashkenazi cooking.
Yes, and I would say that, galareta, also another name for it, is very popular in Poland. In other words, there are dishes that dropped out of the Ashkenazi Jewish culinary repertoire in the diaspora that continue to be very popular in the places from which they came.
Yes, in Russia that would be Khaladet, which you find on every zakuska table.
Exactly. And also it's, presented very beautifully. My mother would make it and she would put it in like a Pyrex rectangular pan. So it wasn't very thick and it was always with hard-boiled eggs, always. And it was served cold. Whereas when I think of it in Poland, it'll rather be served as, basically it's aspic, but it'll be served maybe molded, not cut into cubes from a big rectangular pan, and it'll be served with a little bit of vinegar, for example. And in the fanciest restaurants that serve classic Polish cuisine. So that for me is very interesting, that on the one hand, foods in Poland that Poles also made that are only marked as Jewish when they leave Poland. But on the other hand, foods that Jews abandoned when they came continue to have a life in the places that they left. So it's a very dynamic situation.
That's fabulous. So I have follow-up questions and a comment. A comment first, I guess, which is that in Israel, many times I've had beitzim, that is chicken or turkey testicles, in some of the Jerusalem street food type restaurants, well, takeout restaurants. I prefer the livers and the kidneys to the balls, but and then my question though is there any place to get calves' feet to make pcha in America? I think, because I know that
actually it's very hard, Kathryn, because I needed to prepare this recipe for the performance, and I also wanted to put a recipe in my new Russian cookbook. And it turns out, even though we're surrounded by farms here, I went to farms in Massachusetts and Vermont and New York State where they raise cattle, and they are not allowed by the USDA to sell the feet or the heads. And so finally, I made a connection with a guy in New Jersey who knew someone who could get me some feet, and he brought them up from New Jersey. He drove them up and deposited them on my doorstep. If I had wanted to buy, like 300 pounds, I could have gotten them from a commercial purveyor because they are available. But just to get, I wanted 4 pounds or 8 pounds. That wasn't possible. So it's hard. It's a struggle.
But also that the feet, knuckle, those parts are very rich in collagen, which apparently is great for your skin. So who knows? There might be a way to make a comeback with these. Yeah. But of course, there's tongue as well. And
tongue is wonderful.
I love tongue.
Yeah, I love tongue.
But speaking of skin, my grandmother used to take pickle brine, and this isn't the brine that most Americans would think of that is vinegar. It's actually the brine that results from lactofermentation of the cucumbers to turn them into kosher dills. And so it's basically just salt and a lot of what we now call probiotics and some garlic and other flavorings. And she would take that brine and she put it on her skin every night. And even into her 70s, she hardly had any wrinkles. I've been thinking of doing it, but I don't know.
I'm not ready to try that. But
does it have a garlic aroma? That's the question.
That's the thing.
Yeah, you have to get plastic pillowcases or something.
Right.
I wanted to comment on the potato because it's actually very interesting. In Russia, it was introduced early in the 18th century by Peter the Great, who was passionate about the Netherlands and brought it back from Rotterdam. But the Russians were terrified of potatoes because they grew underground and they had eyes. And so therefore they were associated with the devil. And despite all these ukazes, these edicts from Peter the Great and then by subsequent czars and empresses in the 18th and into the 19th century, the peasants revolted and would not plant them. So they weren't widespread until the mid-19th century. And then, of course, once they realized that they were a very good food source, they became ubiquitous, but it wasn't immediate.
Well, I would say that we'd have to add to that tomatoes. We'd have to add corn. And then if you go a little bit sort of as, actually, there's also the influence from Turkey, which had a huge, Ottoman Empire had a huge influence, not so much on Ashkenazi cuisine, but for Romania, which is a mixture of Ashkenazi and Sephardi. You've got eggplant, zucchini, you have...
Mama Liga.
Yeah.
The corn.
And I'm fascinated because the recent article, I think it was in the Times, about this UN intangible heritage designation for Ukrainian borscht. I'm so fascinated by the use of tomatoes in these dishes because clearly the classical form of these dishes didn't have tomatoes. Cabbage, yes. Beets, yes. Maybe pickle brine or sauerkraut or something else that would be tart. But not tomatoes. And you get it in chalupchis, you get it in stuffed cabbage, you get it in these borschts.
Borscht, yeah.
Wow. And of course, and I think you implied it, but I'm not sure you stated that the potato and the tomato and corn were New World discoveries.
Yes. And peppers.
And peppers too?
The peppers, chili.
Really?
Chocolate. Yeah, but we should stay on point.
On topic, yeah. But just imagining all these cuisines without potatoes and without corn and without tomatoes, it's just sort of...
One thing that sort of drives me crazy, but again, it I think points up the dynamism of these processes. So I have often participated in these Latke Hamantaschen debates. And I have to say that Williams, I was always undefeated because I insisted on being on the Hamantaschen side because
no way.
Because the potato wasn't introduced until quite late. So anyway, I had my whole spiel. It's supposed to be fun. But so you have the classic, the now classic potato latke that is fried in lots of oil for Hanukkah. And it's really important to have that symbolism. So beginning in the 1990s, when everyone was so fat phobic, they wanted to take away so much oil and start baking the latkes in the oven. And it was at about that time that the root vegetable latkes became really, really popular. And of course, people had been making them before. You can take any of these root vegetables, you can grate them. I mean, beets are a perfect example. Turnips are really good. Rutabagas are too. And make pretty parsnip to get a little bit of sweetness. But latkes then morphed into something that was kind of newfangled, even though in fact it was older than the potato.
Yes, and actually very interesting to bring back the blini as a Hanukkah food, well before potatoes.
Wow. Yeah. So this comes to another question, and then I want to go to cookbooks, but this is maybe the last one about sort of Jewish foods in general. How would you define authenticity in food? As recipes are passed down through generations and shared and altered through cookbooks, what determines an authentic or traditional recipe? In a way, you've sort of answered this with the latke and the bagel examples, but I'm wondering what else you might have to say about the notion of authenticity.
Well, it's this huge red flag. I mean, it doesn't have any meaning, I don't think. To me, what is authentic is what is being made by a person at that moment. That is the reality. And at that moment, it is entirely authentic. If people think of, Italian red sauce restaurants, as classic Italian food, but that relied on the tomato, which, as we've said, didn't get there for quite a while. So I don't know. How about you, Barbara? I just think it's a false premise that there are foods that are authentic. Well, there are foods that are traditional, and I would accept that. But
so usually, if you were to ask that to people, they would say, authentic. It's the way my grandmother made it. It's the way my mother made it. That would be one kind of an answer. In other words, it's very much exactly what you've said, which is it's made by a person and it's identified with them. And particularly if you know it from childhood and you formed a very deep attachment to it, then it becomes the yardstick against which you measure all variations of it. That would be the first thing. The second, I am reminded of a fascinating article, I think it just appeared in the foreword, about the British baking show.
Oh, the Great British Bake Off.
Yeah.
Yes. And, oh my God. So you've got these people who it's like they're from Mars when it comes to Jewish food. Babka, challah, they call it a braided loaf. There are several other things as well, where it's so clear they have never actually experienced it other than from some recipe that somebody's trying to cook or bake. And what's clear is that is about as far from authentic. I don't know what you'd call it.
I'd call it clueless.
Clueless, yes. Clueless. That's okay. Clueless is at one end of the spectrum. My grandmother is at the other end of the spectrum. And then the question is, what's in between? So what I would say is that it's not a matter of what you or I would identify. In other words, it wouldn't be like we set up a kind of like the food police, Jewish food police, and that we adjudicate, this is authentic, this is not authentic, this is more, this is less. No, rather, it's a matter of looking at the ways in which people deal with this question in their actual lives. So again, the bagel, because this is a great one. So it transformed to such a degree that there emerged what I would call a quest for the, quote, authentic bagel. And what was produced is what I would call the heritage bagel. And that is a construction. It is not like, it's not a kind of UNESCO designation. It is. I would say that it's a kind of, I call it, forgive me for the lingo, a mode of cultural production. It is something. It is an idea, and it is a food that is produced around certain understandings of what the, if you will, original, authentic bagel, etc., is. And clearly, it has nothing to do with the aubergine or the pretzel. It's, whether they claim it as the Montreal bagel, which is for me off the table, or it's the New York bagel, or whatever it is, the bagel wars. Essentially, it can produce a war, a bagel war. But I think that it's, for me, the authenticity question is a question that I would approach empirically, ethnographically, to see how it is that people who care about such a question proceed to litigate and adjudicate what is and is not, quote, authentic.
Wow. So I'm going to go
get the Talmudic scholars on that.
Well, I'm going to head towards books now. And I think maybe we have time for like 2 questions or maybe just one. But because I'm teaching this course on women and Jewish literature, and I'm thinking about women as writers in Judaism, my students asked, how have Jewish recipes shed light on gender roles and a woman's place in the family? Were Jewish cookbooks in the past catering more towards educated women or women of lower status? And I guess this would, I would ask even more, what is the first Jewish cookbook? Who wrote it? Where was it? Was it published? Is it only in manuscript? Is there one from the Geniza, that was thrown away in the synagogue in Cairo sometime between the late antiquity and the 19th century?
Not that we know of. I think the earliest that I've been able to find are these manuscript cookbooks in Yiddish, and there's several of the same one in Prague, in the Jewish Museum collection in Prague. And it strikes me that sort of the quick answer, and Darra can obviously supplement, the quick answer is this, that these those manuscript cookbooks, which were obviously for some kind of a cooking class, were intended, we don't know for sure, but they're probably intended either for young brides who and or their servants that they would have to supervise. And what we see is that these cookbooks are intended precisely for women that will cook, for women that will work as household help in the kitchen. And they're also written by women who are professionals who either ran a restaurant, in the case of Fania Levando and her Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook, published in 38, actually. I think it was copyright 37, but it was published in 38.
1937, 38, right?
Yeah, 37, 38, because I think it was appeared first with the 37 date, and then the copyright date was a year later. But and we know from some of the other ones that when the cookbook author explains who the person is, that we have cooked in many different, important kitchens or in restaurants, that they traveled. So you have women that were actually professionally engaged in restaurants, food preparation, catering. And the cookbooks are also important for big events like weddings. So I think that, well, of course, it depends on the cookbook as well. But in general, that's how I mean, Darra, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. I think that what I find most interesting is the way the tone of the instruction changes over the centuries. So if in the beginning it really is a manual on how to make these foods, something else starts creeping in. And I'm thinking primarily of the Jewish cookbooks that were published in Europe in the languages I can read, and also in the United States. And that is that there's a concern of loss of tradition. And so it's not just teaching the recipes so that they can be reproduced in a so-called authentic way in the kitchen, but it's also about keeping the Jewish home and remembering these foods that are part of the cultural heritage. So you have different strategies that the cookbook writers use. They often will have chapters on how to set a table. Sometimes they have prayers that are meant to accompany the service of these different foods. They'll have all kinds of hints that have to do with Jewish life and not specifically with what goes on in the kitchen. So I think that is one whole segment of the Jewish cookbooks that I find really interesting.
Fabulous.
And there's a kind of elegiac tone to some of them.
And we're talking about 19th and 20th century, or 20th century only?
If I can just say this, that the 19th century generally aren't nostalgic or particularly interested in Jewish food. The 19th century cookbooks, in almost to a cookbook, are attempts to ensure that in creating elegant German, European, cosmopolitan food, that those socially aspiring women will not abandon kashrut. So that is the main. If you look at the earliest Jewish, really in the 19th century, the earliest Jewish cookbooks, which are in those very early manuscripts are in Yiddish, but the other ones are all in German, until much later in the century, and in going forward, like 1870s will be in Polish. But let's say the first half of let's say from before 1860, they're overwhelmingly in German. And they, the only sort of nod, and what you get is you get instructions for how to maintain a kosher household. Yes. You might have a section at the back for Easter, which is Passover, but it will really be, the statement is, you can do just as beautiful, interesting, elegant, stylish food as everybody else and also still be kosher. That seemed to be the main thrust of those cookbooks. It's not until, I would say that it's not until later that you get cookbooks that are more about traditional food, about traditional Jewish food, and the feeling that somehow or other in this effort to be elegant, that somehow or other something valuable about Jewish culinary culture got lost along the way. And then it's another whole ball game. And that would be, I'm thinking, of Gastronomie Juive, its Yiddish translation.
I'm thinking the 1920s is
and
when
the 1920s. What's fascinating there? The story of the transformation of Aunt Babette to the Jewish cookbook, which is a reflection of a shift from the German immigration and this, very German sort of style Aunt Babette to a recognition of this mass immigration with Jews coming from all over Eastern Europe especially, and then reflecting now that those are really Jewish cookbooks, not just in name. I mean, in fact, Aunt Babette doesn't say it's Jewish, but it's Block. The Block is the publisher. I mean, why would he publish it? But I would say that Jewish cuisine as such in cookbooks is in large measure a 20th century phenomenon. I don't know, Darra, would you have examples earlier?
Oh, no, I don't. I mean, there are a couple in the 19th century, Esther Levy's.
Yes, and also actually the Jewish Manual.
So there are two important ones, one in the UK and one in the United States.
You're absolutely
Those are the only two that are coming to mind.
And it's interesting because the Jewish Manual is very British with a lot of Western Sephardi dishes in it. Very, very interesting. And it's written by, quote, a lady. She doesn't identify herself as Lady Judith. And Esther Levy, we don't know very much about her. I worked like crazy in Philadelphia to try to find out more about her. And it's obviously, she's British also. So, of course, it published in the U.S. and obviously she was in the U.S. But you're quite right. Those two are outliers. And maybe it's a matter that so many of the Jewish cookbooks of the 19th century were published in German in Germany, and that the ones in English, those two in English, were of a completely different order.
I think that's true. And I'm going to have to get off in a few minutes, I'm afraid. But there's another aspect to it that perhaps is significant, and that is that for the families that were not as well educated as the assimilated German Jews who were writing down recipes and publishing them, the recipes were transmitted orally. There are many countries in the world where a cookbook tradition didn't really begin until the very, very late 19th century. So I think that the idea of a bound cookbook with the recipes written, it presupposes that someone will be able to read them, whereas there are other means of transmission that are oral and experiential. So that would be something to investigate further.
That's fascinating.
I have to apologize that I have to get off. I have another thing.
Thank you. Well, can I just say thank you so much? This is just so rich. And as you said before, I think when I first sent you the questions, one of you said maybe a whole course could be taught to answer these questions.
Indeed.
And so
and I think some of us, Darra has taught a whole course.
Yeah, not specifically on Jewish cookbooks, but yeah, in the Comp Lit department, cookbooks as literature. The best course I ever taught.
I can imagine. I'd love to see the syllabus sometime. Wow. Well, thank you so much. My students will be thrilled, and I'm thrilled.